Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, I work at Solace Apartments, which is a 30-unit supportive housing facility in St. Peter. We're like, kind of unique where we are multifamily, and we are all supportive housing. We work very closely with like the local drug court, local in-treatment centers, probation, and that's where we get most of our referrals, because all of our units are by referral only, so they're referred in, because they kind of need that. It's people who kind of need that safety net almost between being completely on their own and treatment. So we're not treatment. We have on-site services available, but they're not mandatory. They don't affect their lease. They sign the same lease as everyone else in a wood management building signs, but we help them get connected with the county supports to help them pay for it, all of those sort of things. So I work pretty closely with probation and drug court and treatment centers. And kind of what was going through my head while Amy was talking, I said this Wednesday as well, is just that definition of success in recovery, and how that has to be an individual thing. You can't just place one definition of success on every single person, or nobody in recovery is going to feel like they're successful. Even April, was on the call, who was in the last issue, I don't remember when it came out, last June maybe,
Yep.
Of Minnesota Press, who's spoken in front of legislation. She had relapses in our building, and we had, me and property management went to bat to make sure that she stayed housed at Solace. But if we had decided, okay, you're not successful in this program anymore, so you need to leave, like, her story wouldn't be out there, and her story is impacting a lot of people. And it's crazy to me that someone can have like lupus or cancer, but if they go out of remission and need more chemo, or they have a lupus flare up, like, they're not failing that disease. They're still alive, they're still fighting it. But when someone has a relapse and suddenly they're no longer successful in recovery, even though it's, the same type of thing, it is a substance use disorder, it is a disease, it's not a personal failing. And I feel like that's what I'm fighting the hardest for in the housing first model, of someone can relapse and still be successful in our program.
I was going to say, I think, so one of the biggest things is getting locations. And so the housing partnership has taken existing apartment complexes and townhomes, and they've transitioned to supportive housing. Solace is unique in the recovery aspect of it, and being plugged in with like a therapist on site. And Ashley is a huge part of what makes Solace so magical. I could go on and on about all the things she does for all of the residents there, and all the things she's done for me personally. But the housing partnership does have other places similar to Solace in the supportive housing part. But getting property is an issue, especially now. I mean, since COVID, the cost of like lumber and things like caulk and paint, and it's just ridiculous. Like, we've had to put a couple of things on hold. So at Tortolette Park, there was this proposal for this area called the Pasture, which is owned by the Sisters of Notre Dame. And they had this community proposal, and they had community members come, and everybody was kind of just going to discuss the hesitations that people might have, because the sisters, their main values are community and collaboration, right? Because they're a big part of this community. And so the architect,
James.
Yeah, he came, and he was expecting to just kind of do a Q&A up on stage, or the whatever, and he was met with resistance that came out of absolute left field. Just that one guy and started getting loud, and just really, he seemed just ignorantly against creating this housing. And then Margot did mention that there were some things that she feels might have had to do with BIPOC. It was not low income, but also the stigma around low income, like addicts and and welfare recipients and, you know, whatever. And it spread through the crowd. So it was just, I think the thing that was the most off-putting is it was like this one negative belligerent guy completely started this uproar, and Jesse was not that he was ill prepared, but it was just so unexpected that they didn't even know how to respond to it. And so we didn't end up following through with that project. They're still working with the sisters, but this was a huge, beautiful area. It would have been a really big project, and it would have helped a lot of people. A lot of people. And it's just a pasture that's just like fenced off. You know what I mean? So it's interesting how quickly negative can spread.
And so it wasn't going to be 100% supportive housing, but it was going to include supportive housing. But that was, at least at my time with the partnership, that was the most flagrant NIMBYism that I've experienced with any project. We've had it in other places, but it was just, I mean, we've never, to my knowledge, had it so badly that we've just stopped the project. And I mean, they hate the idea of low income housing and the idea of supportive housing. There was just a great deal of stigma attached to that in the community. After that meeting really kind of organized it, even within their community social media pages, their neighborhood association, and everything really, I mean, it just continued on and on and on. And people,
there are now like statistics and there's proof that having somebody that's come out of addiction connect with the people who are going through it, that early recovery makes a really big difference. And so those things are becoming recognized, but that grace is extremely, extremely important, because a lot of us come from a place where we didn't learn how to process emotion. We didn't learn how to process difficulty. We didn't learn how to, I mean, for me, mine was so bad that I couldn't have too happy of a moment without feeling like it was too loud, you know? And so there is this thing when you're kind of rising up out of it and you've been down for so long, where you sabotage, because self-destruction is kind of the goal before we go through like the therapy and everything that we need, right? And that sense of community is huge. And so for me, when I had stumbled and I was facing potentially losing my home, and Ashley went to bat for me, and also Brandon, the manager, and Judge Crable, right? They went to bat for me to be able to stay there. That gave me a huge sense of like, I'm worth something. And if I can't love myself yet, they do, you know, so let me do this, you know. It gave me something to work for. And all of a sudden it wasn't just community and fellowship, really, and just feeling like somebody's got your back and you matter. Like you're not just an addict, but there's a lot in that too, right? Because when you have a place like Solace, if people were allowed absolute grace, because we've had waves where like a lot of people will relapse and things will get to the point where it's like, okay, this person has been kind of like suffering for a while and is maybe not the best for the community as a whole, you know? So it's like, there's nothing that we can really put on paper in black and white that says, but I do feel like that grace is huge. It's been just so huge. And like the sense of community and having somebody who genuinely cares.
As you're trying to get more projects like Solace and more kind of that housing first mentality in projects, I think a big part of it is redefining what success is on an individual level. I mean, April obviously is sober. She's on our board of directors. She has a job. Like, I mean, you're a textbook success case, but there are other successes in Solace that look different than April's. You know, I have somebody who came into my office and said, I relapsed yesterday. I already talked to my probation officer. I already have my bags packed to go to treatment. And I know that I can come back here. That's success for that person. You know, it's not always you never relapse again and you get a job and you're doing great. That's not how success is going to look at each person. And if that's the only way success is being defined, then housing first is never going to work. But you have to say, like, admitting relapses, going to treatment, and still having a place to live, even like relapsing 4 or 5 times in 3 years, but maintaining housing through that entire 3 years, that's success as well.
Yes, and having that safety, that security, that's huge. And not, because then you feel safe with talking about it. And the one thing I've noticed, the key ingredient in recovery is being able to be honest about it and talk about it and not feel ashamed or hide it.
Okay, we still have these parameters we have to stick within because it is community living. It's low income housing tax credit project. It's not treatment. It's not a halfway house. It's not sober living and all of that. But that was essentially the provider we were working with at the time, as it got closer to opening, wanted to require everybody who came in to do a full psychological assessment. And he wanted to have very distinct plans for everybody that we put in, and basically require services. And none of those things are required at Solace because it is a person's home first and foremost. Anything coming from us is not going to require services. That is always optional, but we do everything we can to make it available, to refer people to outside sources. And so I think that is a big piece of it, is really defining what are those goals and making sure people have similar understandings of that. To do this type of work within that affordable housing tax credit type framework, it is much different than if, there's a project that might be funded through some other means that maybe we didn't have that access to or didn't know about at that point in time. So we really do have to fall under that umbrella and make sure it stays community living. Everybody has their own lease. We don't enter people's apartments without their permission. We don't do checks on things. We do a monthly inspection for cleanliness, for everything else, which is more frequently than we do it in other projects, but it's part of the lease, and we make sure that we've explained that and put it in there. And so we're not going to go in beyond that and police anybody. And so that's occasionally sometimes what we have to remind some of those community stakeholders of, is because they're used to, from the treatment court, probation end of things, or, as a treatment provider, they've got some control sometimes over people's space, their comings and goings and all of that. We have to remind them, even if you've got that control isn't being enforced by us as property management or as the housing provider. That's fine. You can come in and do your thing in your role the way you would with any other, person that you're serving that is living anywhere else, but that's not something that comes from us. So I think having that shared view of success for the project, definitions of the project, I think is really, really crucial. And being able to build the relationship with those stakeholders. If we didn't have the relationship we had with Judge Kriebel now after this many years, if she started to say, well, I just want to have, let's check on this person, I want to kind of, stay on this person's tail, she wouldn't take that feedback that, oh, wait, but we can't do that. That's got to come from your treatment court or from your probation officer. That can't come from us. But we've got that relationship built with those stakeholders. So when there are those issues, we can continue to have that conversation and educate each other across the board.
And on a smaller level too, I do have monthly meetings with like probation, with our arms workers and our therapists, and the county workers. Like, we do meet monthly about Solace to say, okay, like, who's doing well, who's struggling as an entire group, how can we wrap around this person if they need it? My role is limited to this, your role is limited to that. How can we work together in those two roles to make sure that this person is doing as well as they can and is going to keep their housing?
My experience at Solace was one of a drug court participant. And so Judge Kriebel did have very firm grip on my whole being, right? Because when you sign up for drug court, it's like, I am facing this much jail time / prison time. Help me get better because my problem is addiction. And so you kind of sign over some basic rights. And so I wasn't allowed to have boys over for like a year. And she recognized that as a problem before I did, and I've been single and doing great since then, and like the random drug testing and curfew and stuff like that. So my experience on that end, like the refining process, was much different for me.
Kind of on your first question of how do you get over that, like, deserved homelessness, I feel like it all has to come down to just individual stories, because as long as things are abstract and statistics, I mean, you can make statistics say whatever you want, but when you get and you hear somebody's story, like, there are times where I'm just talking to residents and I'm like, huh, I probably would have done meth too if that happened to me. And just getting to know that story. So what April was saying, kind of the people that have left, I think we've only had to do 2 kind of real evictions because of behavior, and one,
at least at Solace, we don't have kind of that deserved poor mentality. It really is just you're human. There's things that have happened. We're hoping that this can help be a support there. And so there's not any other sort of framework or rubric that anybody's looking at to do. We just go by that wait list. When you're at the legislature, a lot of it so much comes down to funding, because there's not, to make a project like this work within the tax credit program, there's some hoops to jump through. It's a little bit challenging, particularly in greater Minnesota. There's just not the funding available. So finding investors, finding the private, if you can find private people and investors who are interested in this, it can make a huge difference. And then services funding too, like the dollars that are out there to provide services is really limited. Like I said earlier, we use what's called the housing support program, but honestly, that program is intended for single people. We have made it work for families, but it leaves things tight for a family because of how that program works, and basically leaves them with only $111 a month for their personal needs for them and their families. But then it's also really limits what we can provide services for the whole family, because technically our services is only for one person as opposed to the household. So, different, I don't know what the answer is for what type of services funding needs to be more available or what needs to be out there, but that's, funding out there for housing or other mechanisms outside of tax credit for these types of projects, I think would be really important, while still making them community housing and not the sober or, treatment type facilities.
Okay.